Claire Thompson stood at the window of her townhouse in Seattle, watching the rain trickle down the glass like soft tears. It was a quiet evening, the kind that wrapped around you like a blanket you didn't ask for. Outside, the world looked washed out, gray and tired, just like her heart. In the next room, her husband Daniel was on another late-night work call. His voice was calm, professional, and distant, like always. He had become more of a roommate than a partner, someone she shared a roof and responsibilities with, but not her soul. The silence between them wasn't new, it had grown slowly over time, like a crack in a wall that no one fixed until it was too wide to ignore. Claire leaned her forehead against the cool glass. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman in her early 30s who looked fine on the outside but felt empty on the inside. She missed being touched without reason, kissed without schedule, loved without distance. Her marriage hadn't always been like this. There had been laughter once, and passion, and a kind of closeness that made her believe it would last forever. But life had slipped into routine: emails, meetings, deadlines, bills. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped reaching for each other. Now, Daniel spent most nights in his home office, always one door away, but emotionally miles apart. Just then, her phone buzzed on the side table. She picked it up, already guessing who it might be. One name lit up the screen: Noah. Her heart gave a quiet flutter she didn't want to admit. Noah James wasn't just anyone. He was her best friend, Rachel's older brother. More than that, he was a memory of long summer nights, of music and secrets and moments she never forgot. Years ago, they'd shared something real, something brief but intense. But life pulled them in different directions. She moved to Boston for grad school. He stayed back in Vermont to help his father's business. They lost touch, as people often do. But a few months ago, after an accidental comment on an old photo, they started messaging again. At first, it was innocent, catching up. But lately, the messages had changed. That evening, Noah had sent her something simple but dangerous. "Still thinking about you, even when I try not to." Claire's fingers trembled slightly as she reread it. It wasn't just the words, it was what they stirred in her. That feeling of being seen, of being wanted. She hadn't felt that in so long. Not with Daniel, who now asked more about her work schedule than her dreams. Not with anyone. Noah's messages made her feel like a woman again, not just a wife or a planner or a name on a shared mortgage. She heard Daniel's chair creak through the thin wall. He was probably getting up to grab coffee or check another spreadsheet. He wouldn't come looking for her. He wouldn't notice the way she stared too long at a message from another man. Claire knew this was dangerous territory. She wasn't the kind of woman who broke vows, but she also wasn't the kind of woman who lived quietly in the background of her own life. The truth was, she didn't know what scared her more: how Noah made her feel, or how little she felt when Daniel walked into the room. And as the rain fell harder outside, Claire stood there in silence, one hand on the window, the other holding a phone that still glowed with a message she hadn't answered. Yet it all began 8 summers ago, on the edge of a quiet lake in Vermont. Claire had gone to her best friend Rachel's family cabin for a weekend getaway: fresh air, good food, and a break from her stressful internship in Boston. She hadn't expected Noah to be there. Rachel's older brother had always been a bit of a mystery to her. He was the kind of man who didn't speak much, but when he did, it landed somewhere deep. With his slow smile, messy dark hair, and that habit of looking at people like he already knew what they were thinking. Noah was nothing like the men Claire usually dated. He wasn't polished or driven by ambition. He was calm, quietly confident, and deeply grounded in a way that made her feel safe. That weekend, everything felt easy. They went kayaking in the early morning mist, shared beers on the dock at sunset, and stayed up late talking about books, music, life. There was one night, especially under the stars, wrapped in a blanket, her head on his chest, that stayed with her like a song she could never unhear. But they never made it official. She was leaving for school. He had just taken over his dad's auto shop. Their lives were moving in opposite directions, and so they let it fade. No big goodbye, no promises, just a quiet parting of ways that never really felt like an ending. Years passed. Claire moved to Seattle, got married, built a life filled with structure and to-do lists. But Noah stayed tucked in the corners of her mind. She saw him again briefly. At Rachel's wedding, he looked older, broader, but his eyes were the same, calm, unreadable but warm. They shared a polite hug, a few short words, and then were pulled away by the swirl of guests and music. It wasn't until months later, during a sleepless night, that Claire came across an old photo from that lake weekend. Out of impulse, she liked it. An hour later, Noah messaged her. "Didn't think you still remembered that trip." And just like that, the door opened. At first, it was casual. "Memories. How are yous?" The safe kind of small talk people use when they're tiptoeing around old feelings. But with time, their messages deepened. They started texting every few days, then every night. Claire found herself waiting for the little buzz of her phone after Daniel had gone to bed. Noah wasn't flirtatious in the way most men were. There were no cheap compliments or awkward emojis. He asked her how she felt. He remembered things she didn't realize she'd shared. He noticed details no one else did, like how she always paused before sending a voice note, or how her laughter sounded different when she was tired. One night, after a long, lonely day, she confessed that she felt invisible in her own marriage. Noah didn't give advice. He just said, "You deserve more than silence, Claire. You used to light up when you talked about life. You used to dream out loud." And something about that message broke her. Not in a painful way, but like a soft crack in old ice. Dangerous, beautiful, and impossible to ignore. It wasn't just attraction. It wasn't even about sex. It was about connection, about being truly seen. Noah reminded her of who she used to be, the version of herself before she learned to settle. And slowly, dangerously, she began to wonder what it would feel like to stop settling. She wasn't planning to fall. She wasn't even sure if she had. But every time her phone lit up with Noah's name, she felt her world tilt a little more. And Daniel, still sleeping beside her every night, never noticed a thing. The air in Portland was warm and smelled like barbecue smoke and fresh-cut grass. Claire had made the drive alone from Seattle that morning, telling Daniel that Rachel's family gathering was something she didn't want to miss, even if he had to work. He didn't ask questions. He barely looked up from his laptop. So, she packed her weekend bag, put on a soft summer dress that made her feel like herself again, and went. But in her chest, something tightened with every mile. She knew Noah would be there. Rachel had mentioned it casually, not knowing the weight those words carried. And now, here she was standing in her best friend's backyard, holding a glass of white wine, pretending her heart wasn't racing. Then she saw him, across the yard, next to the grill, in a worn gray t-shirt and faded jeans. Noah looked like a man who belonged exactly where he was. His smile was still slow and familiar, and when he saw her, something changed in his eyes, like the quiet surprise of seeing the sun after a long gray winter. "Hey, stranger," he said, handing her a plate, and that same steady look that always made her feel both exposed and safe. Claire laughed softly. It was the first real laugh she'd let out in weeks. They stood together under the shade of the old maple tree, away from the noise of the others. The conversation flowed so easily, memories, music, stories about the people they'd become since that long ago summer at the lake. It was supposed to be friendly. It was supposed to be innocent. But the truth hung between them like heat in the air. Every brush of his arm, every shared glance, felt heavy with all the things they never said years ago. Claire could feel it in her skin, the way she leaned in too close when he told a joke, the way her eyes held on just a second longer than they should. At a T1 point, they both stopped talking. The space between them was suddenly quiet and thick, like something waiting to be broken. Noah reached out gently and touched her hand, his fingers barely brushing hers. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. Claire didn't pull away. She couldn't. The touch was electric, warm, and familiar. A feeling she hadn't felt in a long, long time. There was no kiss, no dramatic moment. Just that small, quiet connection, a whisper of what had been and what could still be. Noah looked down at her and said, almost under his breath, "If you asked me, I'd wait for you." Claire didn't respond. She couldn't. Her throat tightened with emotion. It was too much too soon, and yet not enough. They stayed like that for just a moment longer, standing close but not crossing that last line. And then Rachel called them over to take a group photo. Claire stepped back, fixed her hair, forced a smile, but her mind was far away, caught in the feeling of his hand on hers, the sound of his voice, the way her heart had woken up for the first time in years. That night, alone in the guest room, Claire lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought about the way Noah looked at her, the weight of his words, the warmth still lingering on her skin. Her phone buzzed quietly on the nightstand. A message from him. "I meant what I said." She didn't answer right away, but her fingers hovered over the screen, trembling with something she couldn't quite name. All she knew was that this was no longer just a memory. It was real. It was happening. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could pretend it wasn't. The drive back to Seattle felt longer than usual. Claire kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting in her lap, where her phone sat silently, as if it too was holding its breath. She hadn't replied to Noah's last message, "I meant what I said." She read it more than a dozen times, letting the weight of it sink deeper into her. Her heart wasn't confused anymore. It wasn't about temptation or attention. It was about something far more painful, what she was missing. By the time she walked into the townhouse, the evening sun had already faded. The living room was dim, quiet, and familiar in the way a hotel room is: clean, functional, and cold. Daniel was on the couch, half asleep, TV flickering in front of him, a glass of untouched scotch sitting on the coffee table. He opened his eyes briefly, mumbled a "Hey, welcome back," then turned his attention back to the screen. That was it. No hug, no kiss, no curiosity, no noticing. Claire stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling like a ghost in her own home. She walked to the kitchen, took off her coat, and opened the fridge without knowing why. She wasn't hungry. She just needed something to do, some small motion to make her feel present. But her mind was somewhere else, still under that maple tree, still hearing Noah say he'd wait for her. It wasn't just about wanting him. It was about remembering who she had been when she was with him, open, light, curious, alive. She missed that version of herself more than anything. Being with Daniel had become a routine, a quiet arrangement, where love had faded into habit and intimacy had turned into silence. Later that night, Claire sat at the kitchen table long after Daniel had gone to bed. Her phone lay face up beside her. The house was still, the kind of silence that wrapped around your neck. She picked up the phone and opened their message thread. Noah hadn't written again since that last text. He was giving her space. He always respected her boundaries, even when he was begging with his eyes. Claire thought of his touch, soft but sure, his voice steady but full of longing. He never pressured her, never crossed the line, but he made her feel like someone worth waiting for, someone who mattered deeply. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She thought about what a reply would mean, not just to him, but to herself. Was she ready to admit that something inside her had already changed? She didn't send anything, not that night, but she didn't delete the message either. Instead, she sat in the quiet and let the tears come, not out of guilt, but from a deep, aching sadness she hadn't let herself feel in years. She loved Daniel once, but somewhere along the way, they stopped reaching for each other. And now, her heart had found its way back to someone who made her feel seen, truly seen. That kind of connection doesn't come often, and when it does, it doesn't leave quietly. As she turned off the lights and walked toward the bedroom, she passed by Daniel, fast asleep, his back turned to her. She stared at him for a long moment, wondering how they got here, wondering how many more nights would pass like this. Her phone buzzed again, soft and gentle. "Noah, still here, just in case you need me." Claire didn't reply, but this time, she smiled, just a little, because for the first time in a long time, her heart whispered back, "I know."